Hello again. Okay, so I wanted to use this opportunity to talk a little bit about how we are going to read the textbook this semester. Now, given that this is a Literature 272 class, I would assume that you all already know how to actively read something. But I wanted to just use this opportunity to review some active reading strategies that you can incorporate in your reading as you are reading the literature during this semester. So, the first thing I wanted to talk about is this idea of rereading. It is very important that you reread all the selections that you encounter this semester. So, one of the strategies was known as the SQR3 strategy. And basically, what SQR3 stands for is to survey, to ask questions, to read, to recite, and review. Okay, so basically, when you encounter a reading selection, the first thing you want to do is survey the text. Look for any bold words. Look for any vocabulary that might be unfamiliar. Look for any subject headings. Look the outside. Look at the outside of the reading selection. For example, is there any information included about the author's background, the social context in which the author wrote that particular piece? In our book, like I said before, our book is very interactive, so there's going to be a lot of outside information that surrounds the actual short story. So you want to survey that information before you even get to just to get a feel or a gist for what's going on in the text. Then you can ask yourself some questions. Make a list about maybe 10 to 15 to 20 to maybe even 30 or 40 questions that come into your mind after you get a gist of what's going on. So you can ask yourself questions about characters, or how this character might interact with another character, or what's the setting of this story. You can even ask yourself you can even ask yourself, what do you think the major theme of this story is going to be based off of the time period in which it's written. So try to make some assumptions. Try to, ask some questions. Try to make some assumptions about what you are going to read, because that gives you kind of like a foundation schema to approaching the text. And then finally, you want to, I'm sorry, finally you want to get to the R's, which are three R's. So the next thing you want to do is actually read it. Okay, so you want to actually read it carefully. Take notes. There's another active strategy that you can incorporate in reading, which is annotating. Annotating is a really good way to have a good sense of what's going on in the literature. So as you're reading, read the story paragraph by paragraph, and then after you, for example, read paragraph 3, take some notes about what's going on in that paragraph. Jot down things that seem unfamiliar to you. You can even just basically tell what's happening in your own words, because this will give you an understanding of what's going on, and it'll help you read carefully, and it'll help you understand those nuanced events that take place in the story that sometimes we miss out on when we breeze through a story for the first time. After you read the story, you want to recite some of the main points that took place in the story. One of the things I always tell my students, and I know that it sounds like, it sounds like I'm crazy for doing this, but I pace up and down my house, or I pace up and down the hallways I talk to myself about some of the main events that go on in this story. So it's this idea of recitation that really helps you capture in some of those main ideas in the story. So now that you've surveyed it, now that you've asked questions about it, now that you've read it and taken notes and annotated, to have a conversation about it. Recite some of that information that you've just read. If you don't have anyone to talk to about it, talk to yourself about it. Or have a conversation with one of your friends or family members about a story that you're reading. Through the process of recitation, try to make some connections between some contemporary forms of cultural expression that you might make a connection to, or perhaps try to ask other questions about the author's intent of writing that story, okay, or maybe again how this might connect to another story that you've read. And finally, go back and review some of the main points and some of the questions that you brought up in the question phase. This way you can go back and see if some of your forecasts were actually fulfilled in the story. So that's just one method that you can incorporate in regards to reading the story, and that's called the SQR3 method. Another way that really works for me is this idea of reading and responding. So what I do when especially if I'm encountering a short story for the first time, what I like to do is have a piece of paper and take notes as I'm reading and divide that paper into two columns. The first column is what do I see, and the second column is what does it mean. So, like I said before, in the process of annotating, how you're taking notes to when you read is the same thing that you would write in the what I see column. So this is what is actually happening. So say, for example, we're reading Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find, and you want to just document the events and how the story happens. So for example, they first start off at the home, and then they get into the car, and then they start driving off, start on the road trip, and then they run into the misfit. And then, if you want to just document those events as they happen, that would go into the what do I see column. The what do I mean column is pretty self-explanatory. So in this situation, you are referring to, or I'm sorry, you are interpreting each event as it's taking place. So this is a way for you to break down and analyze, to critically analyze actual events as they're happening in the story, which will help you write an overall analysis when you write your final literary analysis at the end of the semester. So that's basically using the what do I see, what does it mean, reader response sort of method approach to analyzing literature. Another way is to analyze an actual literary device. So you can look at character, ask questions about character, ask questions about setting. One of the questions that you can ask about the setting is, would this story be the exact same story if it were to take place in another time period, in another setting? And why or why not? So when we think about this idea of naturalism and how the book talks about naturalism and how the environment shapes the characters within that story, you can ask yourself, well, would that same story be the same way if it were in an urban space versus a space like in a field or a pasture? Okay, so these are some of the things that you can ask yourself about setting. You can also ask yourself things about plot. You can also make predictions about plot. So after you've read half of the story, sit back, close the book, and try to make some predictions as what's going to happen next. This will also make sure that you are actively reading because, again, you'll be aware and conscious of the forecast and how that forecast is fulfilled as you're reading the story. So these are just a few things that you can incorporate in your reading to make sure that you have a really good understanding of what it is that you're reading, so that you can write some really strong responses in your assignments, and so that you have an easier time writing your literary analysis. I'll be posting some more active reading strategies on the Facebook page. If you have an active reading strategy that you would like to share on the Facebook page, I'm sorry, please feel free to share that. But in the meantime, good luck with your reading, and I will see you in cyberspace.